Hi, and welcome to this episode of I've Got This Kid. I'm your host, Cherina Williams, licensed speech and language pathologist, homeschooling mom of two, wife of one, here to share everything speech, language, play development, and all that other stuff that falls in between. World changers, I am continuing on this back to school rampage, and we have covered kindergarten readiness. We've debunked myths about kindergarten readiness. We ain't dealing with flashcards and ABCs. We've talked about homeschooling from the lens of a mom. Not just me, but a whole nother mom who homeschooled 6 kids. And now this week, I am so proud and excited to have my brother, Italo Brown, Dr. Italo Brown, here with us today because we're going to talk about how to return to school safely. Things are starting to change quickly, and I just thought that it would be amazing to have him on the show to just talk about what he sees and what the science is saying at this point. And so, Dr. Brown, I'm going to let you do your thing and introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Cherina, for having me on the podcast. I mean, you've really built this from the ground up. It's been a family affair, and I think that your insight is very special and unique. So I just am honored to be here with you today. I'm Italo Brown, physician. I also go by Dr. Brown, Dr. Italo. If you're my patient, I'm cool with either of those. But no, I'm originally from Sacramento, California, Morehouse College grad, Boston University grad for public health. I went to Meharry Medical College, another HBCU. Shout out to HBCUs, by the way. And then trained in the Bronx, New York at Jacobi and Montefiore, 2 hospitals that are recognized as the top 20 busiest hospitals in the US. And if you kind of have followed the coronavirus pandemic, you would have seen that these hospitals were hit tremendously hard in New York. At that time, I was here in Stanford. So now I'm in Palo Alto, California, servicing the Palo Alto and East Palo Alto community through Stanford.
Man, for all you do, I've watched you from when, back in our old college days, all the way up. And I can't say enough how proud I am of you and everything that you do and everything that you've taught us along the way. So let's get right into this. Should parents be concerned about sending their children back to school this fall?
I think that it's very normal for people. So first of all, right now, there are a lot of things that feel abnormal, that feel like, first time, first experiences, and we are struggling to define what normal is. Well, one thing that I can say confidently is normal is for parents to be concerned, right? I think that is exactly what should be going on. Parents saying, hey, what are the protocols to return? How are we going to ensure safety of our children? And specifically, how do we have some reassurance that our child will be prioritized and their health will be prioritized by the systems that they return into? So yes, there should be a level of concern. If the question is, should they be concerned that their children are not safe? I think that there are factors involved in that conversation, right? So one, depends on the age of the child, right? So we know right now, if you're 12 years old or older, you are eligible to get the vaccine. So that conversation has to occur at the family level. But if your child is younger than 12, then it's like, all right, so what precautions are you using to protect these children? Are you providing masks? Are you providing spacing that's adequate so there's social distancing inside the facility? Are the professors or the educators or the teachers being required or asked to consider vaccination? And if they are, then how are you ensuring that critical mass is reached so that there seems to be like a herd immunity within the cohort of the classrooms, right? So these are things that I would be questioning from the jump. And then I think there's broader questions that you're wondering, all right, so how does this interfere with children interaction? How do you make sure that there's still normal development of children? What if in the last year, there's some trauma that's being addressed by these children? I mean, because there's been a huge displacement of kids who are in the educational system. So I think that there is reason to be concerned. I think that there needs to be intelligent concern, not just kind of all right, everything is falling apart and we need to find somebody to give us complete answers, because that's not what you're going to get.
Right. And I like how you use the term intelligent concern, because I hear a lot about, well, we're not going to do it. The vaccines hasn't been tested enough. It's not safe enough. But How do you communicate that to families, like the safety of the vaccine and how to intelligently concern yourself? And how do they advocate on their child's behalf to make sure that their child is safe?
Well, a couple of things. So I am a big fan of finding trusted messengers and trusted sources of information. So I think that the parents have to be invested in that process. Like you can't just say, I'm going to listen to, your local news or media outlets. You've got to do some of the digging. And then part of that digging requires a little bit of insider knowledge, right? So, I mean, here's the big secret is like, there is an entire society for children's health that you can follow, right? And I would look at the pediatric societies, right? Like medical societies that are like, I don't know if it's American College of Pediatrics, but they have those type of different societies that give out recommendations, and they're basically putting their careers and reputations on the line behind the knowledge because they've done the due diligence of reading the papers, having the conversations, asking the tough questions. They've seen literally hundreds of thousands of patients, and they are going based upon general consensus within that group. So I would start by looking at their recommendations because that's literally from the horse's mouth. That's the closest you can get to
Right.
it. The second thing I would say is we've got to be better at misinformation. So knowing what isn't true, debunking things. So, people will believe that, if I give this vaccine to my child, the child isn't going to develop right, might turn into, a bird or some other kind of crazy stuff. Like there's always some sort of like, weird rumor or some type of thing attached to these conversations, and you've got to tease apart that. And then I think the last part is there's a certain degree of communication that has to happen between you and the child, right? Like to understand the child's apprehensions, to understand the child's level of understanding around what's happening over the past year. And then you take all those things into account and make an educated decision based upon your level of comfort.
I couldn't break it down any better myself, hence why you're here to break this down, because I have this conversation and I hear this a lot. And some people are on some end to where it's a lot more relaxed, especially for those who are already vaccinated. They kind of feel like, oh, we can relax on things. And then on the other hand, I hear people who have not gotten vaccinated and still don't buy into that. And so we are 16 months in of being in this pandemic. And a few months ago, once the vaccine really started rolling out, people thought that they were a lot more safe. But then we started hearing the buzz about the Delta variant. And I would love for you to explain, like, how is the variant different than what we were looking at 16 months ago?
Okay, so there's a couple of things that kind of stand out to me. We understand the virus. So first off, we have to tease apart some of the language, right? SARS-CoV-2 or coronavirus is the viral infection. It's the threat. COVID is the syndrome that happens that we see in the hospital as a result of that viral infection. And so when we talk about variants, the variant isn't COVID. COVID is still the same. It is still the same constellation of syndromes and symptoms that we see, right? But the variant is the virus, and that virus has ways of kind of like changing. It's almost like it wore a different outfit that day. You didn't recognize it. So when you were prepared to see that virus look a certain way and you recognize it a certain way, and then it comes in looking a little different, that's a variant. So the main thing is this is not an abnormal thing for viruses to do. That's what they do. They tend to wear different clothes, change the hat. And it's a pattern for them. And we're good at predicting how these variants play out. Now, what makes this one different than previous versions or previous iterations of SARS-CoV-2 is the fact that it causes more severe disease because of how it affects the lungs. Like it has a specific way of being communicated. And I think that it affects lung cells a little bit more intensely than what we previously thought of the strain that first kind of came on the scene. But why that's important is for those who are unvaccinated, it means that you are getting a more sophisticated version of the virus, and it's harder for you to fight that illness. And it's different from, we see that adults and children kind of, children are resilient. And I say that not as a way to kind of encourage people to like go one way or the other, but because we know that these viruses have affected children more commonly than adults, because coronaviruses in general are more common among children than adults. And so while there are different variants, children have been exposed to a lot of different type of viral agents, and their immune systems have a little bit of plasticity or can kind of be flexible a little bit. And it's different for adults because we've had like time to kind of like develop familiarity, and then we get stuck in our immune systems kind of get stuck in their ways. So we have very different reactions.
Okay, interesting. I like the analogy of it wearing and changing outfits. And I think even that line can be a way that parents start that conversation with their child, especially when asking them to mask up.
Exactly.
Going out in the community, seeing, the little ones when they're indoors and they're kind of resisting their parents about wearing those masks. But if, world changers out there have that conversation before they leave the house, like, hey, this virus is different and it's wearing different clothes. Maybe it was a summer vaccine and now it's a winter vaccine. And so it's wearing the heavy stuff and we don't want the heavy stuff on us. So let's mask up. Even having like those conversations with your little sugar can change the game on how they understand the virus and how you communicate to them. I love the way that you broke that down and just made it a language thing because, language is my jam. And so,
Right. Now, I know. I did my homework.
and so, when we're talking about language and we're talking about like, how do we make something so complex, not only easy for us to understand, but also easy for our sugars to understand so we can have that conversation and say, yeah, it's this thing going on. Yeah, it could be a scary thing. But when you use terms that make sense to them, then it becomes a lot more palatable for everyone. And so when we're thinking about the variant, and we know now that it's in a different outfit, I'm gonna steal your term.
Right.
What does it look like for safe return? Just because there have been so many mixed messages, like we've seen on the news, and you're right, like my undergrad degree was in speech comm. And so all we did was researching like agencies and outlets. But now we're in a time to where stuff comes so quick and it's not always backed up. And not only is it not backed up, it's not fact checked. Like the sources aren't quite there. And even when you dig a little, you find out that the source ain't necessarily really a like valid, reliable source. Exactly. And so like when we get those mixed messages, how do we ensure or like how do we guide these world changers to fact check what's going on? I love that you brought up APA. APA is real and they do have like really good information that's out there, but where else would you guide world changers to?
Yeah. I mean, so here's the thing. If you're going to go with news outlet information, you got to kind of like streamline and filter through it. Realize that they have two agendas. One agenda is they want to get a message out as broadly as possible. The other agenda is that a message has to be somewhat, it has to be click worthy, listen worthy, and potentially a little bit blown out of proportion. So I keep that lens on whenever I watch the news. I'm like, all right, so they're trying to give me something sensational, right? The second thing that I consider off the rip is if I'm on social media, like looking through memes, looking at people's pages, I'm like, all right, so what does their profile say specifically? So when I go and I see their little post, I go to their profile and I'm like, what do they do? Where is their validity? Do they have credentials? So you should be checking credentials of the people who give you conversation around this. If they don't have a degree in advanced biology, if they don't have a degree in medicine, if they don't have a degree in public health or epidemiology or biostatistics or all these fields that actually allow them to interpret the data effectively, their words do not become fact. They become opinion at that point. Like this is opinion. And then I'd say that information that you do get from like family and friends, realize that it is coming through a filter, right? That it's almost like that childhood game of telephone, where it may have started out actually a real fact. And then as it passed through like 9 or 10 different people, you got some version of the fact that isn't accurate, right? So, and I find this out all the time when I discuss things like the vaccine with people, because they'll start off by saying like, yeah, man, I heard there was like 3 of them, Moderna, Pfizer, and Johnson & Johnson. And then like one of them is trash and the other one is like really good. And the other one is just kind of there. And you'd be like, all right, so you got some good information and then somehow it turned into weird information. So, you just have to be able to tease that apart for folks. I trust if you go on Instagram and you're looking up pediatrics or pediatricians. So like go to hashtag pediatricians and you can look at different ones like hashtag adolescent pediatricians, hashtag, teen docs or whatever. Like they have cool hashtags and you go to their pages and you will see their credentials. And a lot of times these physicians, they know that they are public facing. And so they make sure that their information is accurate. So I think that that's a good place to start if you're talking about handheld devices. Again, American College of Pediatrics, ACP, they do a great job of having some information available. There's also an osteopathic pediatrics group that does the same thing. I think it's ACOP that provides recommendations as well. And these are, as I said, they are staking their claims against fact and their reputation. So that's what you want. Someone who's like, look, we've done the research. And if we're wrong, we will stand up for the fact that we were wrong.
Okay, very good. Very good. So in your case, I know for you, a lot of times you see patients once they're already there. They're already ill.
Yeah. That's how they tend to show up into the emergency department.
ER is real, y'all. I heard the stories over the years. But hey, when you're talking to patients, especially those that were once like anti-vaxxers who didn't necessarily believe in getting the vaccination, how do you communicate or articulate to them? How does their mindset even change over time? How do you see that? Or do you see any kind of like evolution of like, okay, I once thought this, but now?
Yeah, it is a very tough group to kind of like get through to sometimes. And it's not their fault. I don't think that anti-vaxxers need to be kind of like lumped in the same category as like people who clearly distrust everything about science. Because sometimes there are anti-vaxxers who are highly intelligent, who are well-read, and they're making a decision that they believe is based in their understanding of the science, right? So like, I don't think that it's an educational issue. I don't think they're unintelligent. Right. The other thing that I'll say is a lot of times this is compounded by smaller case in point situations where they're like, hey, I know somebody who didn't do this and it worked just fine. I know somebody who, right, they didn't, I just, treated the child with chicken noodle soup and, they never caught measles, mumps, or rubella. I never went and, got a tetanus shot for my child and they get scrapes all the time. They're fine. Like these are case in points, but what it really comes down to is broad numbers. And you have to look at the literal hundreds of thousands of pieces of data to make those claims. It can't be brought down to case in point because people can gamble all the time until they actually lose. That's not fun, right? Because then I'll see that. That's when they come to my department is when they lose. So I don't know if, and at that point, these viruses are undefeated. They're better at that part than we are at staying away from them. So that's one of my messages I send. The other thing is I think that we have to take a second to listen, right? We really got to try to find middle ground and say like, all right, so you're not comfortable with this because of why? And then really go as deep as you can to see like what is the stem or what is at the base of their discomfort with the idea. So getting that knowledge allows you to kind of formulate an approach and give them supplemental information that helps them to make a better decision than what they previously made, right? So it's like if I told you in the middle of you thinking that, the sky was orange, and I said, well, hey, there are these greenhouse gas, there's gases that change the color of the sky to the point where what we interpret is blue. And you're like, okay, I didn't know that. And so it might basically be new information, right? So I think that there is a huge opportunity for clinicians who are educators to try to reach this group. We have to do a better job at accepting it when we are not able to convince them, right? Like, hey, all right, can't convince everybody, but you do your best. And maybe there are a percentage that you do change. And if it is changing, it may not be on everything. It may be just on this one issue. And that to me is enough.
I agree. And not only that, it made me think about minority communities. And we know, looking at the data, that minorities, Black and Brown communities have been hit really, really hard. Probably the hardest. How do we bridge that gap? I know within my field, I am one of a minority, and I constantly work to debunk those myths and the ideas and patient client, those right. relationships, to even get the buy-in, to even get them to trust like the medical community, to trust me as a clinician to do due diligence.
Exactly.
Which is a whole conversation in and of itself. How do we reach those communities to where there's been so much distrust within Western medicine and so many just gaps in care? How do we address that community to get more buy-in?
Yeah. So people of color, first off, this is a community that I represent, and I love to speak about our health as though it is not just like highly prioritized, but something that's cool. Like, cause that's the real issue. Is for so many years, we haven't made it something that's cool. It's been stigmatized. You don't have these conversations. Everybody does their own thing health wise. We don't mess with doctors. Like all of these concepts, like I'll be good with just, some Robitussin and some Tiger Balm, some hot toddies, like all of these like remedies that we kind of passed down, Vicks, Vapor Rub through generations, like being the cure-alls and almost self-healing out of the fact that we did not have equal access to care, and the fact that often we could not trust the providers that we were given. Like that is something we've had to combat fiercely. And especially in the midst of a pandemic where it's like, hey, I have not seen a single person who needed a physician's help and said like, I'm not going. I've never seen that work out in their favor. I've never seen that work. Like you just be at home, oxygen level is like 70 and you're just like, I'm gonna be all right. I'm gonna find some oxygen. No, you need to go into a facility that has oxygen because we don't have it at the house, right? And Vicks is not gonna help us. So, right. So that's been a huge hurdle. But the point of your question that you're asking is like, how do we create a culture inside of communities of color where we can have this conversation and everybody feels included, and I can provide scientific stuff and answer their questions as well. So, or we can provide scientific background and answer their questions as well. First, I'll say this. I'm going to speak specifically about Black folk because that's what I represent. Black folk are not wrong for having questions. We can't gaslight our communities of color for having questions, but there has to also be accountability on those parts too. Like, hey, we do have increased disease incidence, meaning like we do have more underlying conditions. We are typically ones who have higher heart disease, higher stroke risk, higher, diabetes risk, and everything else, and the list goes on. And because of that, it's not going to be even playing field when disease is brought into the picture, right? Like any disease. Right. The second part is there are not enough clinicians of color, meaning that we don't have enough people who look like us, who come from our families, who we can ask these questions like how you and I are talking right now. Like where we can have this conversation, very minimal impact, like not inside of the four walls of a hospital. Like we could have the conversation at a house. We could have this conversation over some food, and I can bring up these things comfortably and not feel judged for not knowing. Right. Like that's kind of the next places. So we've got to create, we have to use the outlets that are available. And, things like your podcast, things like having Instagram live chats and those that create this environment where it's like, I can ask anything. I feel comfortable. This is my people. Like that's the next step. And I think the last thing is if there is apprehension, like really trying to understand why are you Like, what makes you hesitant? What makes you hesitant to either get tested about for SARS-CoV-2 or any coronavirus variant? What makes you hesitant to have a conversation about a vaccine? What makes you hesitant for putting your arm out there and accepting the vaccine? And then you have people who've done each one of these things to provide perspective and insight. It can't be preachy. It can't be like, I'm telling you to do this because da da da. Like, we don't respond well to that. So you have to use some sensitivity with the approach and really understand that these communities, like, trust is such a valuable currency to us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just have to really work at that trust factor.
Man, thank you.
No problem.
Thank you. I want you to tell the people about Barbershop Medicine.
So your husband and I, for some of the listeners that don't know, we all went to the same college. And there was another brother there. His name was Jamil Lacey. He lived down the hallway from us. Marcel lived on the fourth floor at that time. He lived on the fourth floor. We lived on the first floor. Jamil Lacey truly is a visionary, and his concept of trap medicine kind of came about in 2014. I was in Oakland, actually living on your guest space when I was doing my rotations. I told you I was my brother. I was out here in Oakland trying to get a job, or as a med student trying to get into a residency program in emergency medicine. And I was at a hospital here. During my time, I spent some afternoons with Jamil, and he was talking about using barbershops as an avenue to discuss health topics with young Black men and boys. And I was like, yeah, I'd actually done some research on that. And I published something in 2011 about that. And then there'd been like literally a couple of decades of work done in barbershops to address hypertension or high blood pressure in Black men and try to reduce their risk of strokes and other heart disease. So I was like, this is going to work. But the reason why it works is what I just stated earlier about comfort level, right? So for Black men, we go to barbershops pretty frequently pre-pandemic. It was like a country club for us. And that familiarity, that the lower threshold to be vulnerable in that space is what makes it perfect to introduce ideas around health and wellness. And so the other thing is you reach everybody. So in a barbershop, you can see a very older gentleman, you can see a young child, and you can get all of that across one swath of people in a single approach. And you can tailor your messages to get parents involved, speak to children. You can reach a lot of people very quickly and speak about a lot of different issues very quickly. So that's why doing barbershop medicine is a thing. The show that you're probably talking about is in conjunction with YouTube and Macro. These entities basically came together. They had a pool of money and they were like, hey, we need to do something that increases our diversity on YouTube, because when you go there, you don't always see a whole lot of Black faces. And when you do find them, it's like, hey, who are these people? How do I see more of them? Can I get more, please? And YouTube listened. So Barbershop Medicine was developed to show people that health and wellness conversation can go viral, that there can be, very high level discussion that is real, authentic, and informative, so that people of color can feel represented in the space of health and wellness, and you learn something along the way.
And that's how we start, right? And that's how we change the trajectory of things.
Exactly.
I couldn't be more proud. What else you want to add for the people before we close this out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest questions that I've been getting lately have been around like, all right, so realistically, what in the next 2 to 3 months are we going back into quarantine? Are we going back into, into the caves? And so that's what people like, are we returning to the cave? And my answer was, you should have never turned the light off. You should have never turned the light off. But no, I think that if you look at across the U.S., what we have to keep in mind is, there are different state-based policies that, this is going to be handled at the state level. It won't be handled at the federal level, meaning no one is going to release a federal mask mandate or a federal whatever. That's an overreach of government. But At the state level, at the local level, you will get these little recommendations. You'll get someone say, hey, you can't go into these certain spaces without masks. Or, hey, like New York just said, to get into a gym, you're going to have to show a vaccination card. So I think that there's a plus and a minus behind doing that. And we've got to be very ahead of the curve as people, like parents, friends, family members, like be ahead of the curve, which is like, understand society will shift towards safety. Like that is the hope, is like, how do you make most people safe as possible? With that said, like there will be more of that, more like, hey, to get in this space, you got to show a vaccine card. And then it may not necessarily land well.
Right.
So you've got to kind of figure out where you stand. And if you're not immunized or going to get a vaccine, be prepared to do some things that are not traditionally like in alignment with that stuff. Like, hey, maybe you're going to have to spend more home dinners now. You know, can't go to the restaurants that you used to because they're going to have a mandate for those things. And while it is your choice, understand that you also are helping keep other folks safe by not going there, by staying at home, by keeping your mask on. Like that is, if your decision is to not get vaccinated. Now, for those of us who are vaccinated, your job is going to be behave. Like just because you're vaccinated, don't go out there and be like, it is not a bulletproof vest. It's not something where you can walk out into the street and it's just like, nothing's going to affect me. You can still get this virus. You can still have some symptoms. The point of the vaccination was not to make you completely impervious to all danger. Its job is to make sure that you don't die or that your hospitalization risk is lower. Right. That's it. That's the main take-home message. Vaccine equals fewer death, fewer hospitalizations. Most likely can manage these symptoms at home without the help of a physician. That's what the vaccine does. Without the vaccine, higher likelihood of death, higher likelihood of being hospitalized. Those are the things. And again, this is for mostly adults. When we talk young people, those numbers shift tremendously. It just means that greater incidence, no unvaccinated children, specifically 12 years old to 18, have like a higher likelihood of having severe illness. Okay, unvaccinated. My main take-home message after all of this is said and done is give yourself some grace when it comes to this conversation. It's not easy. There's a reason why we haven't had a pandemic in over 100 years. Is because the last time we had one, people are probably still recovering from a generational level, to see what happened. It definitely is impactful. So give yourself some grace because these conversations are new. Our current lifestyle is very new. And when you're dealing with a young person who's growing up in this, think about how this is going to shape their outlook and how their behaviors are going to be adjusted because of this. And it's unprecedented. So just as they're learning, like think about how it was when you were a child and you're learning about the world and learning new things. This is also happening to you as an adult while it is happening to them as a child in real time. So both of you are on a journey. You got to give each other grace as you go through this.
Agreed, 100%. And World Changers, I want you guys to be comfortable with the idea that you can be vulnerable and say to your little sugar, I don't have all the answers. It's okay. And it's okay to go on that journey together to find out some of those answers for your older sugars, for your younger sugars. Tailor that conversation, tailor it to make it work for you, tailor it to work for them, and be comfortable with what you do know and be comfortable with what you don't know. But again, just make it a journey together. I know you guys can do this.
I got a funny thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I talked to my buddy yesterday, called me. He said, his wife was basically saying like, you need to get the vaccine. He was the only one that had held out. I mean, he has some baby girls. They're not vaccinated because they're too young, right. But the wife is vaccinated. And she was like, hey, you're working in a person or a public facing capacity. And like he sells cars. And he was like, my wife's basically telling me, you're not going to come back in this house at the end of this week unless you get this vaccine. And so he called me and he was just like, man, I'm scared. And he was like, I'm gonna be honest, I'm scared. And we started talking about his fear. And the funniest part to me was he brought up all the different types of the vaccine. And he was like, which one should I get? And I was like, I mean, I can't really make that decision. The one that they have that's available when you show up. And I was like, what did your wife get? And I was like, why don't you just get the one that your wife gets? And he said, why would I do that? If she turns into a zombie, I need to be the person that doesn't turn into the zombie. He was like, so I'm gonna get the other one. Those fun conversations are what makes families remarkable, that even though in the midst of a pandemic that you can have moments like that. Like, it's a very serious situation, but just the fact that he was like, hey, there's gotta be a strategy. If you get taken out, I need to be able to stay here. He said, we made a zombie pact with one another to where, like, yo, if someone's turning, you gonna get me first. Just gonna take me off the table. And then now you take care of the family. I love it. So I was just like laughing the whole time while he's telling me this stuff. And I'm like, this is what like healthy families are doing in a pandemic. Right. And we can't lose those moments, even though it's weird. And even though there's a lot of non-science in that conversation. It is. I don't care. I just would rather them laugh. I would rather them, have those moments, because some of the stuff around us is not laughable. Right. And so do take the time to do that. Keep yourself sane. Right.
Dr. Brown in the building. Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you.
No, I'm blessed to be here. And your platform is fantastic. I really enjoy the way that you present this information and how you are charismatic. Our children need this. Our parents need it desperately, because I see the ones that come in the emergency department and are like, what do I do? I'm like, take this child up off of my hands. What do I do? So yeah, they need more of you. And if I could prescribe a dose of this podcast, I would do it.
Thank you so much. World Changers, that wraps it up for today. Join us next week, where we're going to continue on this journey of back to school. We're going to be talking about cave syndrome and what is that? What does that look like? And how we can start talking to our sugars about dealing with cave syndrome. I know in some districts, y'all are going back. Y'all are heading back. My sister works in the school district. They going back. So we'll talk about that next week. Join us for that. Everything that you need to know will be in the show notes, World Changers. Don't forget to go to my website, I'veGotThisKid.com. Sign up for the interest list for my upcoming book, Watch Me, Connecting to Your Sugar Through Play. Until the next time, World Changers, take care